In the hills of southern Turkey, there are stone pillars that should not exist. 12,000 years old, precisely engineered, covered in a symbolic code that nobody has fully read, and then deliberately buried by the same people who built them. For 30 years, archaeologists excavated pit by pit and left with more questions than answers. The temple theory never held. The hunter-gatherer explanation never fit the evidence. The site defeated every framework researchers brought to it. Then Grok AI was given the complete dataset, the geometry, the carvings, the burial evidence, the surrounding sites, every measurement, every alignment, every anomaly that human researchers had documented and failed to connect. What the AI found had been hiding in plain sight for 3 decades, a pattern so precise, so deliberate, and so large that no single excavation trench could ever have revealed it. What Grok AI exposed does not just rewrite Göbekli Tepe, it forces a fundamental rethinking of when organized civilization actually began and who was capable of building it. In 1995, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was surveying the rolling hills northeast of Sanliurfa in southern Turkey when he found something that stopped him completely. Jutting from the earth in circular arrangements were massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some rising 6 meters high, weighing up to 10 tons each. The stone had been shaped, carved, arranged with deliberate intention. And according to every dating method available, it had been done 12,000 years ago, making these structures the oldest monumental architecture ever discovered. Older than Stonehenge by 7,000 years. Older than the pyramids by 8,000. Older than the invention of writing. Older than the first cities. Older than agriculture itself. Schmidt knew immediately that what he was looking at did not fit any known pattern. Nothing in the archaeological record suggested that people at this point in human history were capable of this. The accepted model was clear. 12,000 years ago, humans in this region were hunter-gatherers. Small, mobile bands moving with the seasons, living without permanent settlements, without organized labor, without the social structures that monumental construction requires. The pillars said otherwise, and the more Schmidt's team excavated, the stranger the picture became. There were no hearths, no storage pits, no evidence of cooking or sleeping or the ordinary business of daily life, no burials, not a single grave, no domesticated animal bones, no cultivated plant remains, none of the biological signatures that mark a settlement anywhere in the ancient world. What the site offered instead was wild animal bones in large quantities and a near total absence of everyday tools. This was not where people lived. But something significant had happened here repeatedly over a very long period of time. Schmidt's excavations ran from 1995 until his death in 2014. Nearly 2 decades of meticulous, careful, systematic work. His team exposed enclosure after enclosure, mapping pillar arrangements, recording dimensions, cataloging the animal carvings that covered nearly every surface. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, wild boar. The images were precise and consistent, carved by people who clearly knew what they were depicting and had reasons for depicting it. The central pillars in each enclosure stood taller than the rest, positioned in pairs, facing each other across the interior space. The outer pillars formed rings around them. The arrangement was repeated, with variations, across every enclosure uncovered, and yet the reason for all of it remained completely out of reach. The temple label that early researchers attached to the site was never a conclusion. It was a placeholder, an admission that nobody understood what they were looking at. The label stuck because nothing better emerged to replace it. Decades of excavation produced extraordinary documentation and almost no genuine explanation. The pit-by-pit approach, thorough as it was, kept researchers focused inside each enclosure and away from the possibility that had been there all along. That the meaning of Göbekli Tepe was never going to be found inside any single structure. it was written across the entire landscape, and nobody had looked at the whole picture until now. In the summer of 2025, a research team led by Professor Barbara Hoare arrived at Göbekli Tepe with a fundamentally different approach. Every previous excavation had treated the enclosures as individual structures, studying each one in isolation and moving to the next. Hoare's team came to map the entire site as a single interconnected system. They brought ground-penetrating radar scanning beneath the surface across the full extent of the hill, building a digital picture of everything that lay hidden below. The data took weeks to process. When the complete map finally came together, what it showed stopped the team completely. The enclosures were not scattered. They were not arranged by convenience or terrain or the accidents of construction. 3 of the largest enclosures, designated B, C, and D by researchers, form the vertices of an almost perfect equilateral triangle. The distance between each center measured 19.25 meters. The margin of error across all 3 measurements was less than 30 centimeters. On a rough Anatolian hillside, 12,000 years ago, without surveying equipment, without written mathematics, without any tool we associate with precision geometry, someone had placed these structures with an accuracy that a modern surveyor would be satisfied with. The triangle was not the only pattern. The central pillars inside enclosures B and C ran parallel to the triangle's southern side as if anchored to it. Enclosure D, the tallest and most imposing of the 3, sat at the apex. The main axes of multiple pillars across different enclosures pointed consistently northward, but with a deliberate 10-degree offset repeated across the site. Not random variation, not construction error. The same deviation, encoded again and again, suggesting it carried meaning that the builders considered important enough to preserve precisely across multiple structures built across multiple generations. When Grok AI was given the complete geometric dataset, its analysis was direct. The probability of the equilateral arrangement occurring by chance across rough terrain was negligible. The consistency of the 10-degree offset across separate enclosures built at different times ruled out coincidence. The site reflected a master plan, a blueprint that existed before the first stone was placed and was maintained with remarkable fidelity as construction continued. Someone had designed the whole before building any of the parts. This is what makes the finding genuinely disturbing. The people who built Göbekli Tepe are classified as hunter-gatherers. They had no written language to record measurements, no metal tools for precision cutting, no wheeled transport for moving 10-ton stones, no institutional framework that archaeology associates with large-scale coordinated planning. And yet the geometry encoded in the site's layout requires all of the cognitive and organizational capabilities that those classifications assume were absent. The blueprint had to be held, transmitted, and faithfully executed across generations of builders who never wrote a single thing down. Grok AI's conclusion was precise. This was not inspired improvisation or accumulated habit. It was deliberate, rule-governed, and organized from the beginning, which forced the question that the geometry alone could not answer. If the layout followed strict rules, what else say Göbekli Tepe had been built according to a code that researchers had been looking at for 30 years without reading? The carvings at Göbekli Tepe have been described as mysterious since the first pillar was uncovered. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, wild cattle, snakes, and human figures covering nearly every stone surface, rendered with a confidence and consistency that suggested skill and intention. For decades, researchers treated them as religious symbolism, ritual decoration, the visual language of a belief system too ancient and too alien to fully interpret. They were documented, cataloged, and largely left unexplained. The assumption was that meaning, if it existed at all, was probably unrecoverable. Dr. Lena Yilmaz, a specialist in prehistoric symbolism, did not accept that assumption. Her team spent months cataloging not just what the carvings depicted, but precisely where each motif appeared across the entire site. Position on the pillar, height from the ground, cardinal direction the carved face pointed, which animals appeared together and which never shared the same surface. The dataset she assembled was the first to treat placement as a variable as significant as the image itself. When Grok AI analyzed that dataset, the pattern it identified was not subtle. Vultures appeared consistently near the tops of pillars facing east, not occasionally, not as a general tendency, consistently across enclosures built at different times by different groups of people. The eastern orientation aligns with sunrise during specific periods of the year, suggesting the vulture's position was tied to a calendrical function rather than aesthetic preference. Scorpions appeared low on southern-facing pillar surfaces, consistently paired with symbols of wild cattle or foxes. The pairing was specific enough that Grok AI flagged it as a rule rather than a pattern, something that was being deliberately followed rather than organically repeated. The AI's interpretation was direct. This was not decoration. It was a positional code, a system in which the meaning of each image was inseparable from its location. Vultures at the top facing east meant something specific. Scorpions low on the south, paired with cattle, meant something different. The carvings were functioning as a scheduling system, markers that communicated timing, season, and ritual participation to anyone who knew how to read them. A society without writing had built a calendar and inscribed it into the stone. The most striking individual find came from between enclosures B and D. A carved human figure, unlike any of the animal motifs, placed horizontally rather than vertically, its eyes inlaid with shell, staring upward. Wear patterns on the figure indicated it had been handled repeatedly before being deliberately sealed into the fill. Grok AI's analysis of its placement suggested it served as a focal object for ceremonies that coordinated the activities of different groups gathering at the site, a physical anchor for communal ritual that multiple communities recognized and shared. Taken together, the carvings describe something more organized and more purposeful than religion in any simple sense. They describe a communication system, maintained with precision across generations, designed to coordinate the movements and activities of a society spread across a significant geographic area. The stones were not covered in symbols, they were covered in instructions, and for 30 years, nobody had read them. The end of Göbekli Tepe was not what anyone expected. Sites of this age and significance are typically abandoned gradually. Populations shift, structures fall into disuse. Wind and sediment do the slow work of burial over centuries. What archaeologists found at Göbekli Tepe was entirely different, and the difference is deeply unsettling when you understand the scale of what it required. The enclosures were not abandoned. They were sealed. Deliberately, systematically, and on a scale that required an organized effort as impressive as the original construction. The fill material covering the monuments consisted of clean limestone rubble mixed with charcoal, packed in layers with a uniformity that microscopic sediment analysis confirmed was intentional. There were no signs of natural collapse, no gradual silting, no weathering layers between deposits indicating time had passed between one dump and the next. The rubble had been brought in and placed in rapid succession, enclosure by enclosure, until the monuments were completely buried beneath tons of stone. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal embedded in the fill returned dates clustering tightly around 9,500 BC. The consistency of those dates across multiple enclosures pointed to a coordinated closure that played out over months rather than generations. This was not a slow forgetting. It was a decision made collectively, carried out deliberately, and completed within a defined period of time. Someone chose to end this, and then they organized the labor to make certain it stayed ended. The scale of that labor is staggering. Sealing a single enclosure required moving over 1,200 tons of stone. Across the full site, the total volume of fill material represents an effort that rivals the construction achievements of early agricultural civilizations with far greater organizational infrastructure. Yet there is no evidence of farming at Göbekli Tepe, no domesticated animals, no granaries or surplus food storage of any kind. The workforce that buried these monuments was not sustained by agriculture, it was sustained by something else. Shared purpose, collective memory, and a social bond strong enough to mobilize hundreds of people for a project whose only outcome was making something disappear. Grok AI's analysis of the burial sequence identified it as a purposeful closure rather than an act of destruction or defeat. The care taken with the fill, the uniformity of the layers, the absence of any damage to the pillars beneath, all of it pointed to preservation rather than erasure. The builders were not destroying Göbekli Tepe. They were protecting it, sealing it against time in the same way the Takarakori rock shelter sealed those two women against the Saharan heat. The pattern does not end at Göbekli Tepe. At Karahantepe, 35 kilometers away, archaeologists have found enclosures with matching orientations and the same evidence of deliberate burial. The same decision, made by a different community, following the same logic. This was not one group's isolated ritual. It was a shared convention across a network of sites, which raises the most important question the burial evidence forces. A network requires communication, coordination, and the transmission of knowledge across distance and time. None of that is supposed to exist at 9,500 BC. Pull every strand of evidence together, and the picture that emerges is not comfortable. Precision geometry executed across a hilltop without surveying instruments. A positional animal code maintained consistently across multiple enclosures built by different groups over different generations. A coordinated mass burial requiring hundreds of people and over 1,000 tons of stone per enclosure, sustained without agriculture, without domesticated animals, without any of the organizational infrastructure that archaeology associates with that scale of collective action. Network of sites, 35 kilometers apart, following the same conventions, the same orientations, the same deliberate closure sequence. None of this fits the hunter-gatherer model, not individually and certainly not together. When Grok AI was given the complete evidence set from Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding regional sites, its overarching finding was precise and difficult to argue with. What the data describes is not a society at the beginning of a long climb towards civilization. It describes a society that already functions. One with rules, planning capacity, long-range coordination, and the ability to transmit complex knowledge across generations without writing. The standard model places these capabilities thousands of years later, after agriculture, after permanent settlement, after the accumulation of surplus that supposedly makes large-scale organization possible. The evidence at Göbekli Tepe places them here at 12,000 years ago, fully operational. The timeline this creates is genuinely disturbing. If the organizational capabilities visible at Göbekli Tepe already existed 12,000 years ago, the question is not how civilization began. The question is what came before it. Because what we see at Göbekli Tepe does not look like a beginning. It looks like an inheritance. Grok AI identified a degradation pattern in the construction record that deepened this implication significantly. The oldest enclosures at the site, the largest and most precisely executed, show the highest levels of geometric accuracy and carving sophistication. Later additions are smaller, cruder, less precisely aligned. The same inverse pattern identified at the Aswan granite quarries. Technology and knowledge moving backward rather than forward, declining rather than accumulating, as if the builders of the later phases were working from a tradition they could only partially replicate. They had inherited something they did not fully understand. Grok AI flagged 3 possibilities. The first is a lost predecessor culture, a society that developed the knowledge, the conventions, and the organizational framework that Göbekli Tepe reflects, and then disappeared before leaving clear evidence of its own existence, passing its capabilities to the people who built what we can see. The second is an extraordinary accumulation of empirical knowledge across generations, practical, transmitted, refined over a timescale long enough to produce sophisticated results without any single moment of invention. The third is a civilizational timeline that requires fundamental revision, one in which the emergence of complex human organization predates everything we currently use as a marker for it. Each of these possibilities demands the same underlying conclusion. What we call the beginning of civilization is not where the story starts. The story was already well underway. We are looking at a chapter, not an opening. The evidence Grok AI assembled at Göbekli Tepe is not theoretical. It is physical, measurable, and documented. The equilateral triangle formed by enclosures B, C, and D is measurable to within 30 centimeters across a rough hillside. The 10-degree offset encoded consistently across multiple pillar axes is documented in the survey data. The positional animal code identified by Dr. Yilmaz's team is cataloged across every exposed surface of the site. The radiocarbon dates clustering around 9,500 BC confirm coordinated closure within a defined window. The matching orientations at Karahan Tepe are on record. None of this is speculation. None of it requires accepting a controversial interpretation to acknowledge that it exists. The anomalies are real. The patterns are there. The question is what they mean, and whether the frameworks we have been using to answer that question are adequate to the evidence. They are not. The 10-degree offset is the detail that Grok AI flagged most insistently as unresolved. It appears at Göbekli Tepe across enclosures built at different times. It appears at Karahan Tepe 35 kilometers away. The same deviation, encoded in the same direction at sites separated by significant distance and potentially significant time. Grok AI's analysis identified this as a regional convention rather than a local habit, something shared across a network of communities that understood it the same way. What it encodes, astronomical alignment, directional reference, calendrical marker, remains an open question. But the fact that it is shared across sites is not open. That is documented. What this forces is a reckoning with the blank spaces on the map. The Göbekli Tepe region contains dozens of sites that have not been fully excavated, and many that have been excavated in isolation, pit by pit, without the landscape-level analysis that revealed the geometric pattern in the first place. If that pattern was invisible to 30 years of conventional excavation at the most studied site in the region, the question of what is sitting unread at less studied sites is not rhetorical. It is urgent. Every site examined in isolation is a site whose full meaning remains hidden. 3 questions remain that the current evidence cannot answer. Who taught the first builders the conventions that Göbekli Tepe reflects? The geometry, the animal code, the closure ritual, the shared offset. What ended the network, because the deliberate burial at multiple sites within a similar time frame suggests a collective decision rather than independent decline. And whether the burial was an ending or a preservation, a closing of something finished or a sealing of something intended to survive. Grok AI did not resolve these questions. What it did was demonstrate that they are real questions, grounded in physical evidence, not in speculation or alternative archaeology. The patterns are documented. The anomalies are measurable. The inconsistencies with the existing model are verifiable. Göbekli Tepe has been hiding its full meaning not because the evidence was absent, but because nobody looked at the whole picture at once. Grok AI looked. What it found cannot be put back into the frameworks that failed to find it. The pillars were never the mystery. The mystery was always the mind behind them. Grok AI did not discover a new site or uncover a hidden chamber. It did what 30 years of pit-by-pit excavation could not. It read the whole picture at once. The geometry, the animal code, the coordinated burial, the regional network, the shared 10-degree offset encoded across sites separated by 35 kilometers. Taken together, these do not describe a primitive society stumbling towards civilization. They describe a society that already knew what it was doing. The stones were buried carefully, deliberately, as if the builders understood they were closing something that might one day need to be found again. We found it. We are only beginning to understand what it tells us. The real question Göbekli Tepe forces is not what it was. It is what else we have been standing in front of without seeing.